The first time Mimi Alford stepped into the White House, she was 19 years old. Nervous and trembling, clutching her temporary badge like it was a ticket to another universe. She had grown up in a small New Jersey town, raised in a family where politics was distant, almost mythological. To her, the President of the United States wasn't just a leader. He was almost untouchable, a man who lived inside the television screen. Yet here she was, entering the East Wing as a college intern, unsure of what awaited her. The atmosphere of the White House in 1962 was both majestic and suffocating. The halls smelled of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where history clung to the walls. Everyone seemed busy, sharp, moving with purpose. Mimi felt like an outsider, a girl dropped into a hidden world. She could never have imagined how quickly she would be pulled into the very heart of it. That first week, she was introduced to her role in the press office. Small tasks, typing, organizing papers, learning how not to be in the way. She felt invisible most of the time, overshadowed by the towering personalities who roamed the halls. But invisibility can sometimes be the perfect disguise. And in the White House, secrets thrive in the shadows. The moment that changed everything came quietly, like a whisper. One afternoon, a co-worker told her she'd been invited to join a private tour of the residence. The words alone were enough to make her heart skip. It wasn't common for interns to be allowed upstairs, beyond the official spaces. Mimi followed, nervous but curious, her heels clicking softly against marble floors. When she entered one of the private rooms, she saw him. John F. Kennedy, taller than she had expected, his presence filling the room in a way television had never captured. His suit was crisp, his smile easy, and yet there was an intensity in his eyes, a kind of quiet command that froze her in place. The President of the United States looked directly at her, not at the group, at her. The others in the room seemed to blur into the background. He asked her name, repeating it slowly, almost testing how it sounded. "Mimi," he said with a grin, and she felt her entire body burn with heat. He asked where she was from, what college she attended. But there was something in the way he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, that made it feel less like polite chit-chat and more like something else. Mimi couldn't explain it then, but she would remember that moment for the rest of her life. The instant she felt seen by him, and only him. That evening, she couldn't sleep. She replayed every second in her head. The smile, the way he said her name, the brief contact of his hand on her arm. To anyone else, it might have seemed meaningless. But to her, it was as though the universe had shifted. She wondered if he even remembered her face, if he would ever say her name again. What she didn't know was that her life had just been split into two chapters. Before Kennedy and after Kennedy. The invitation came sooner than she expected. A phone call, discreet and polite, asking her to come upstairs again. Mimi froze when she heard it. She thought it might be some mistake, a scheduling request. But when she arrived, a White House aide guided her through a hallway she had never seen, past a guard who nodded as if this were entirely normal. Every step made her chest tighten. She was led into a room where the president was waiting. This time, there were no colleagues, no distractions, just the two of them. He smiled in that easy, practiced way, but up close, it felt different. He poured her a drink, spoke to her gently, asked about her family. Mimi was overwhelmed, hardly able to form complete sentences. She didn't understand why she was there. Why, out of all the people in Washington, it was her standing in that room with him. Then, with With the calm certainty of someone who always gets what he wants, Kennedy reached for her hand. It was not a request, and it was a quiet claim. Mimi felt her breath catch. She should have pulled back, should have said something. But the combination of fear, awe, and a strange kind of thrill left her frozen. She was 19, facing the most powerful man in the world, and he was looking at her not as an intern, but as a woman. That night marked the beginning of a secret she would carry for decades. No one in her dormitory knew, no friends, not even her closest family. To the outside world, she remained the shy, diligent girl interning at the White House. But behind the locked doors of the residence, she became something else. Someone living a double life, tied to a man who belonged to history, but who wanted her in ways history was never supposed to record. Keep watching, because what followed was not just an affair, but a secret carefully buried under layers of silence, until the day it was finally unearthed. In the weeks that followed, Mimi's world became unrecognizable. She was still the same 19-year-old intern on paper, fetching files, typing reports, delivering coffee. But beneath the surface, she was carrying a secret that grew heavier by the day. Every time she walked through the White House gates, she felt as though the guards could see it in her face. She smiled politely, kept her head down, but inside she was burning with the knowledge of what no one else knew. The president's invitations came irregularly, as if timed to catch her off guard. Sometimes days would pass without a word, and Mimi would convince herself it had been a one-time mistake, a moment of madness she could bury and forget. Then a phone call would arrive, gentle but firm, instructing her to come upstairs. Each time she obeyed, her pulse quickened, her hands trembled, and yet she went. She told herself she had no choice, and maybe, deep down, she didn't want one. The White House residence was like another universe, separated from the bustling offices below. The carpets muffled every sound, the lamps cast a golden glow, and the air felt almost too still, as though it were guarding its own secrets. When Mimi entered those rooms, she crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer an intern, no longer just a girl from New Jersey. She was the companion of the President of the United States. At first, she clung to innocence. She thought of their meetings as private conversations, harmless companionship. He asked about her classes, her dreams, her favorite books. He laughed at her nervousness, teased her gently when she stumbled over words. But slowly, his questions turned softer. His touches lingered longer. He was never forceful, never angry. Instead, he carried the calm authority of a man who was used to women surrendering. And Mimi, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of saying no, surrendered. Afterward, she returned to her dormitory in silence. She told no one. She buried her confusion under layers of normal behavior. Homework, phone calls home, lunches with friends. She became an expert in disguise, perfecting the art of pretending nothing had changed. Yet each time she looked in the mirror, she saw a different girl staring back, one who had entered a world far beyond her control. It wasn't just the intimacy that bound her, it was the danger. Every meeting required secrecy, discretion, the perfect lie. White House staff seemed to know without speaking. They avoided her gaze when she walked down certain hallways, opened doors without questions, handed her over to the president's schedule as though she were part of it. The silence of the staff was its own kind of complicity. It reassured her that this was not madness. It was routine. She was not the first. She would not be the last. There were moments when her fear peaked. Once, as she left the residence late at night, she passed another staffer who glanced at her with the faintest flicker of recognition. For a second, Mimi felt sure that her secret had been discovered. The gossip would spread, that her parents would find out, that newspapers would print her name. But the staffer said nothing. The silence of the White House was absolute. It was as if the building itself had swallowed her secret whole. And yet, alongside the fear, there was exhilaration. To walk into a room and see the president smile at her, only at her, was a feeling she could never describe. To hear him laugh at her stories, to feel his hand press against hers, was intoxicating. She knew it was dangerous, that it was a line no one should cross, but once she had crossed it, there was no going back. Mimi also began to notice how carefully he compartmentalized his life. One evening, after leaving his room, she caught a glimpse of Jacqueline Kennedy walking down the opposite hall. Graceful, flawless, her presence like something carved from marble. Mimi froze, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. But Mrs. Kennedy passed without a glance, wrapped in her own world of duties and appearances. The collision of those two worlds, the wife and the hidden girl, left Mimi shaken. For the first time, she realized just how deep the deception ran. She began to live in two separate realities. By day, she was a diligent intern, friendly and unnoticed, writing memos that would vanish into dusty files. By night, she was the president's secret, moving quietly through locked doors and guarded corridors. The two identities never touched, and yet both belonged to her. The weight of it pressed harder on her shoulders, but she bore it, because the alternative, exposing the truth, was unthinkable. And so, the months rolled on. Each meeting pulled her deeper into a story that could never be told. A story that would shape her life long after the man at its center was gone. She could not see it then, but she was already caught in a web of power, desire, and silence that no 19-year-old girl could escape unscarred. The deeper Mimi went into her secret, the harder it became to separate her own feelings from the reality of what was happening. At first, she told herself it was simply an adventure, a fleeting chapter she would tuck away like a diary entry no one would ever read. But the more she answered those discreet phone calls, the more she entered the dim corridors of the White House at night, the more she realized this was no passing thrill. It was shaping her entire life. She began to crave the sound of his voice, the curve of his smile, the sudden warmth in his eyes when she entered a room. It wasn't love, not in the way she had once imagined it as a teenager dreaming of weddings and fairy tales. It was something far more complicated, an intoxication, a dangerous mixture of awe and fear. She was 19, and the President of the United States was the axis around which her entire world turned. But alongside the thrill grew another feeling, a constant, gnawing fear of exposure. At night, when she returned to her dormitory and her roommate asked how her evening had gone, Mimi would force a casual laugh, muttering something about a late shift in the office. Then she would slip under the covers, heart pounding, praying that no one could see through her. She feared the questions most of all, questions she could not answer, questions that would unravel her carefully guarded secret with a single slip. Even ordinary things became dangerous. A misplaced look in the cafeteria, a word spoken too warmly about the president, a letter home where she accidentally revealed too much. All of it could destroy her. She learned to measure every syllable, to hide her emotions, even from herself. She became an actress, rehearsing her role each day, while inside she carried a storm that never rested. The secrecy itself was suffocating. Every meeting with him was followed by silence. There were no letters, no photographs, no gifts, nothing tangible to prove their connection. It was as if she lived in a parallel world, invisible and untouchable, where intimacy left no trace. At times, she wondered if she imagined it all, until the next call came, until his voice pulled her back in, until his hand found hers again in the stillness of a locked room. Yet the more their meetings continued, the more Mimi began to feel the imbalance of power. He was charming, kind, even playful, but he was also the president. He dictated the time, the place, the terms. She never refused him, not because she lacked the will, but because the idea of saying no felt impossible. The man who could command armies, negotiate treaties, and move nations with a speech had chosen her. And in that choice, she lost the ability to choose for herself. It was both flattering and terrifying. There were moments when she tried to reclaim control. Once, during a meeting, she asked why he had noticed her in the first place, what it was about her that drew his attention. He smiled, evasive, as if the question amused him. "Because you're you," he said simply, brushing the hair from her face. The answer was both comforting and hollow. It gave her nothing, yet she clung to it because it was all he offered. The psychological toll began to show. Her studies suffered, her friendships thinned. Her world shrank until it revolved entirely around a man who belonged to everyone and no one. Friends noticed her distance, her distracted glances, her sudden silences. But no one pressed too hard. To them, she was just quiet Mimi, the polite intern who kept to herself. None of them guessed the truth, that every time she disappeared for an evening, she stepped into a secret history that could never be told. The fear of discovery reached its peak one night, when she overheard two senior staffers whispering outside a hallway. She caught fragments. "The girl. Careful. Not the first." The words froze her blood. Were they talking about her? Or about someone else before her? She pressed herself against the wall, breath held, waiting for them to move on. When they finally left, Mimi's hands were trembling so violently she could barely unlock the door to her dormitory. For the first time, she realized she might not be as invisible as she believed. And yet, despite the danger, she could not stop. The secrecy was a prison, but it was also a drug. Each time she told herself it would be the last meeting, that she would walk away and reclaim her life. And each time, the phone rang, and she went. She was caught in a cycle she could neither control nor escape, bound by silence and by the undeniable pull of the man at the center of it. Mimi didn't know it then, but she was already walking a tightrope between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. And one misstep, one accidental word, one glimpse from the wrong person could send everything crashing down. As months turned into years, Mimi's life narrowed to the rhythm of secrecy. On the surface, she was still the quiet college girl interning in Washington, then returning home to her family during breaks, still writing polite letters to friends who wondered why she was so distant. But in truth, she lived in a constant state of waiting for the next call, waiting for the next evening she would be summoned upstairs, waiting for the rush of thrill that came when she entered his world. The secrecy shaped her. She no longer saw herself as a girl among equals. She was different now, set apart by a secret too large for her age, too heavy for her shoulders. At times, she felt a surge of pride. He chose me. Out of all the faces in Washington, He wanted hers. But that pride quickly dissolved into a strange emptiness, because she also knew the truth. She was a shadow, a hidden figure in the life of a man who was loved by millions and married to one of the most admired women in the world. That duality began to consume her. By day, she typed memos and smiled politely at coworkers. But by night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking herself questions she couldn't answer. Did he really care about her? Did she matter to him beyond the locked doors? Was she anything more than a fleeting escape for the President of the United States? These doubts gnawed at her. But she buried them, because facing them meant acknowledging just how powerless she was in the affair that had come to define her life. The moments with him were intoxicating, but also haunting. She remembered one night when he laughed at something trivial she said, his hand resting lightly on hers, his gaze soft and almost boyish. In that moment, she convinced herself it was real, that he saw her not just as a distraction, but as someone who mattered. But the very next day, she watched him on television, his arm around Jackie, his smile dazzling the cameras, and she felt invisible again. The contrast cut deep, leaving her hollow. The tension grew heavier each time she returned home to her family. Her parents were proud of her White House internship, telling neighbors with pride that their daughter worked for the president. Mimi would smile, nod, and play her role, all the while suffocating under the weight of what she couldn't say. At family dinners, when her father asked if she had met the man himself, she laughed nervously and said she had only glimpsed him in passing. Inside, her stomach churned with guilt. Every word she spoke to them was a lie. As time passed, she noticed how normalized the silence had become. The staff who facilitated her visits never asked questions. A glance, a gesture, a closed door. Everything ran like a quiet, invisible machine designed to keep secrets hidden. She wondered how many others had walked those same halls, guided by the same unspoken rules. The thought unsettled her, but it also reassured her. Maybe she wasn't alone in this strange role. Maybe the system itself protected her as much as it used her. And then, suddenly, it ended. November 22nd, 1963. Dallas. Shots fired. The news spread like wildfire, burning through the country in seconds. Mimi was in New York by then, building the fragile outlines of a new life when she heard. At first, she couldn't process it. John F. Kennedy. Gone? The man whose smile had dominated her dreams, whose voice had whispered her name in the quiet of hidden rooms, struck down in a motorcade on a Texas street. She watched the black and white television footage, the chaos in the crowd, the first lady in her blood-stained pink suit, the country paralyzed by grief. And she felt her world collapse, not only because the president was dead, but because her secret died with him. There would be no more calls, no more meetings, no chance to ask the questions that haunted her. The story she had lived so intensely now belonged to the silence of history, but grief was tangled with something darker. Fear. For the first time, she realized how fragile her secret truly was. What if someone talked? What if the truth leaked in the chaos that followed his death? She would be exposed, branded, shamed, her life destroyed. She felt both abandoned and relieved, broken and strangely free. Without him, she no longer had to hide. But without him, she no longer knew who she was. The months after Dallas were the hardest of her life. She moved through them like a ghost, unsure of her place in the world. Friends and family spoke of the nation's loss, the tragedy of a fallen leader. Mimi mourned silently. But her grief was not the grief of the nation. It was private, forbidden, something she could never confess. Every time she saw Jackie Kennedy's stoic face on the news, Mimi felt a stab of guilt so sharp it left her breathless. She had shared something sacred with the man America adored. And now it was locked inside her forever. What Mimi could not know then was that this silence, this unbearable burden, would shape her life for the next 4 decades. She would marry, raise children, build a life on the surface, while underneath she carried a secret that whispered to her in the dark, a secret she could never share until one day she finally did. After the death of John F. Kennedy, Mimi's life drifted into what looked, from the outside, like ordinary adulthood. She finished her education, married, and started a family. To neighbors and friends, she was a devoted wife and mother. Gracious at social gatherings, polite in conversation. Her smile was steady, her voice soft, her presence reliable. No one could have guessed the weight she carried. An invisible stone lodged deep in her chest. Her husband never knew the truth. On their wedding day, as vows were spoken and promises exchanged, Mimi forced herself to believe she was stepping into a new life, one cleansed of the past. But the past clung to her like a shadow. At night, when she lay beside the man who believed he knew her completely, she remembered other nights, other hands, other whispered words spoken in the private halls of power. She never spoke of it, but the silence carved a gap between them that no tenderness could bridge. Over the years, the secret became both armor and poison. It gave her a strange sense of importance, as if she had lived a chapter of history invisible to the world. But it also devoured her from within. Every time she saw Kennedy's face on a book cover, every time a documentary replayed his speeches, every time an anniversary of his death passed with solemn tributes, Mimi felt the ache of a life she could not acknowledge. The nation mourned a fallen leader. She mourned a man she had once known in ways few others had. And she mourned in silence. Her marriage faltered under the weight of things unsaid. Her husband sensed something distant in her, a quiet she never explained. They argued, reconciled, argued again. Years passed in cycles of hope and disappointment. She tried to drown her memories in the routines of daily life, packing lunches, folding laundry, attending church, organizing birthdays. But nothing erased the echo of her past. She carried it like a secret tattoo, etched beneath her skin. For decades, Mimi lived with the constant fear that the truth might surface. She worried about old staffers, about rumors, about stray words whispered into the wrong ear. Each new biography of Kennedy that appeared on bookstore shelves filled her with dread. What if someone had found out? What if her name was printed, her life exposed, her children forced to bear the shame of a story they never asked for? The anxiety pressed against her like an iron hand, year after year. And yet, as the decades rolled on, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't only the fear of discovery anymore. It was the suffocation of never telling her own story. She had been 19, young and naive, pulled into something far larger than herself. She'd been a participant, yes, but also a girl trapped in the orbit of power. To the world, Kennedy was a sainted figure, frozen in golden memory. To her, he was both that and something else. A man who had taken her innocence and left her carrying the consequences for a lifetime. The turning point came as her marriage crumbled. The arguments with her husband grew sharper, the silences longer, until at last the bond snapped. Divorce forced her to confront not only the loss of her family structure, but also the hollowness of the life she had built around silence. Alone, she began to ask herself what had really kept her quiet all these years. Shame, fear, or the belief that her story didn't matter. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps it did. By then, America had changed. Scandals no longer shocked as they once had. The private sins of presidents had been dragged into daylight, dissected by journalists, debated by the public. In that climate, Mimi felt a strange shift. Perhaps it was no longer impossible to speak. Perhaps the shame was not hers to bear alone. And so, slowly, cautiously, she began to shape her truth into words. She confided in a few trusted friends, testing the sound of her own voice as she told them fragments of her past. Their reaction surprised her. Not disgust, not scorn, but sympathy. They saw her not as a scandal, but as a survivor of circumstances that had been far beyond her control. Their compassion lit a spark of courage she hadn't felt in decades. That spark grew until it became impossible to ignore. Mimi realized she could no longer live with a story locked inside her. If she was ever to breathe freely again, she would have to tell it, not in whispers, not in shame, but openly, fully on her own terms. The world might judge her, yes, but for the first time, she believed that the truth could set her free. She'd been silent for nearly 40 years, but silence, like secrets, eventually cracks. And when it does, the story it releases cannot be ignored. When Mimi finally chose to break her silence, she was no longer the 19-year-old girl in a borrowed dress, walking nervously through the White House halls. She was a woman in her 60s, carrying decades of experience, loss, and survival. The decision to speak did not come easily. For years, she had rehearsed it in her mind. How people would react, how the media would dissect her, how her children would look at her when they knew the truth. Each time she retreated into silence. But age has a way of stripping away fear, and eventually she realized she could not leave this world without telling her own story in her own words. In 2003, the secret surfaced in a biography of JFK. Mimi's name appeared, almost like a ghost from the past, suddenly dragged into daylight. The shock was overwhelming. The phone rang incessantly, reporters hounded her, and whispers followed her everywhere. For the first time, the silence she had carried was broken, not by her choice, but by others. And yet, instead of destroying her, it forced her to confront the truth she had hidden for so long. She faced the questions head-on. Yes, she had been involved with the president. Yes, she had been young and unprepared. No, she was not proud of it. But she was ready at last to tell the story fully, without distortion, without shame. And so she began writing. Her memoir, Once Upon a Secret, published in 2011, was not written in anger. It was not a tabloid scream or a scandalous tell-all. It was quiet, reflective, almost painfully honest. She described the awe of being chosen, the confusion of surrendering, the thrill and the emptiness, the guilt that gnawed at her during her marriage, the silence that defined her for decades. She wrote not to glorify what had happened, but to finally release it. To say, this is who I was. This is what I carried. This is how it shaped me. The reaction was mixed. Some readers sympathized, seeing her as a young woman swept up in the power of a charismatic leader, left to live with consequences she never asked for. Others criticized her, accusing her of seeking attention or staining the memory of a beloved president. But Mimi no longer bent under judgment. She had lived too long in silence to fear the voices of strangers. For once in her life, she was speaking on her own terms. In interviews, she often reflected on how the secrecy had defined her. She admitted that she had been naive, that she had lacked the strength to resist him, that she had lived in awe of a man who seemed larger than life. But she also pointed out the imbalance, the way power and youth collide, leaving scars that last a lifetime. She was not excusing herself, nor was she condemning him outright. She was simply telling the truth, raw, unpolished, and human. For Mimi, the act of telling her story was not about the past. It was about freedom in the present. She said she felt lighter, as if the invisible stone in her chest had finally been lifted. Her children knew the truth, and instead of rejection, they offered her understanding. Friends who had never guessed the burden she carried now saw her with new eyes. And most importantly, Mimi herself could finally look in the mirror without feeling like a stranger. She had carried a secret for nearly half a century, through the triumphs and tragedies of life, through the death of a president, through the unraveling of her own marriage, through the endless anniversaries where his name was celebrated while hers remained unspoken. And in the end, she found her voice. The world may remember John F. Kennedy for his speeches, his presidency, his tragic death. But Mimi's story reminds us that behind every legend are shadows, private stories, hidden truths, and human costs that history books rarely record. And as she closed her memoir, she left readers with a quiet lesson: that silence is its own kind of prison, and that sometimes the bravest act is simply to speak.